For 20 years, I lived beside a man who carried a secret heavier than our marriage could hold. My husband's silent struggle with impotence began as a small insecurity, but over the years it transformed into a weapon, one he used against me every time he needed to hide his guilt, his betrayals, and the double life I never saw coming. Instead of seeking help, he hid behind excuses, anger, and humiliation. He blamed me for the intimacy we lost, saying I wasn't desirable enough, not attractive enough, not woman enough. Every night became a battlefield of silence. Every morning, a reminder that love alone could not fix what pride refused to face. But the truth always finds a way. And in our case, it came through the last person I ever expected, his lover. She confronted me not out of pity, but out of rage, because he lied to her the same way he lied to me. She exposed everything. The medications he overdosed on, the secret appointments, the shame he hid, and the reckless behaviors he used to escape the truth about himself. At first, I collapsed. Then, I rose. Because hiding impotence does not make a man weak, but using it to manipulate a woman does. So I rebuilt myself piece by piece. I learned the truth about erectile dysfunction, and I finally understood. The problem was never me, never my body, never my worth. And now, I want you, watching this story, to ask yourself, what is your biggest pain? Comment below. Your story matters. Your healing begins here. If you want to discover how this devastating 20-year lie unraveled and how I found my strength again, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Drop a comment sharing what pain you've been carrying in silence. This story will change how you see yourself. Let's begin. My name is Victoria, and for 20 years I blamed myself for the slow death of my marriage. I carried the weight of every rejection, every cold shoulder, every night spent alone in our bed while my husband slept in the guest room claiming exhaustion or stress or a headache. I internalized his criticisms about my appearance, my personality, my efforts to connect with him physically and emotionally. I spent 2 decades believing I was the problem, that if I could just be better or prettier or more understanding, he would want me again. I was 43 years old when I finally learned the truth, and it came from the most unexpected source imaginable. His lover walked into my life on a rainy Tuesday afternoon and shattered every lie I'd been living with for 20 years. I met Jonathan when I was 21 and he was 24. We were both working at the same hospital in Boston, me as a newly graduated nurse and him as a physical therapy assistant working toward his doctorate in physical therapy. He was confident and charismatic, always surrounded by people who were drawn to his energy and humor. When he asked me out after we'd worked together for about 3 months, I felt chosen in a way I'd never experienced before. Our courtship was intense and romantic. He pursued me aggressively, called multiple times daily, showed up at my apartment with flowers, planned elaborate dates. 6 months after our first date, he proposed. We married 4 months later in a church ceremony with 200 guests. The first year of marriage was passionate and consuming. We were young and in love and building a life together. Jonathan finished his doctorate and started working at a prestigious sports medicine clinic. I was advancing in my nursing career at a major teaching hospital. We bought a small condo in the suburbs. We talked about having children someday, but wanted to wait until we were more established. Everything seemed perfect from the outside, and mostly felt that way from the inside too. The intimacy issues started subtly during our second year of marriage. Jonathan would occasionally have difficulty maintaining erections during sex. At first it happened rarely enough that we could brush it off as stress or fatigue, but the frequency increased over the following months. By our 3rd anniversary, our sex life had become sporadic and fraught with tension. Jonathan would get frustrated and angry when things didn't work properly. He'd blame exhaustion from work, side effects from allergy medication, too much alcohol at dinner. There was always an excuse. Always an external factor to explain away the dysfunction. I tried to be understanding and supportive. I suggested we try different approaches, focus on other forms of intimacy, see a doctor if the problem persisted. Jonathan rejected all of these suggestions with increasing irritation. He insisted there was nothing wrong with him, that I was making too big a deal out of occasional difficulties, that my pressure and expectations were actually causing the problems. He said if I would just relax and stop analyzing everything, our sex life would be fine. So I tried to relax and not analyze and give him space, but things only got worse. By our 5th anniversary, we were barely intimate at all, maybe once every few months, and those encounters were usually tense and uncomfortable, ending in frustration more often than satisfaction. Jonathan's explanations became accusations. He said I wasn't attractive to him anymore, that I'd let myself go since we got married, that I didn't make enough effort with my appearance. He commented critically on my weight, even though I'd only gained maybe 10 pounds since our wedding. He suggested I wear sexier lingerie and makeup more often. He compared me unfavorably to actresses and models in movies we watched together. I internalized all of this completely. I started obsessing over my appearance, going to the gym excessively, dieting restrictively, buying expensive lingerie I couldn't afford, trying desperately to become whatever version of myself Jonathan would find desirable again. Nothing worked. The more I tried, the more he pulled away. The more I attempted to initiate intimacy, the more reasons he found to reject me. I felt increasingly desperate and unattractive and unlovable. My self-esteem eroded steadily over the years until I barely recognized myself anymore. Jonathan also became increasingly critical of me in non-physical ways. He said I was too clingy, too needy, too emotional. He mocked my attempts to discuss our relationship problems, saying I was dramatic and overthinking everything. He spent more time at work, more evenings out with colleagues, more weekends on the golf course or at sports events with friends. When I complained about feeling neglected, he said I was trying to control him and that I needed to develop my own interests instead of depending on him for entertainment and validation. I tried to do exactly that. I threw myself into my nursing career, taking on extra shifts and pursuing additional certifications. I developed hobbies like painting and book clubs and volunteer work. I maintained friendships and had my own social life independent of Jonathan. But none of it filled the growing void in our marriage, or answered the fundamental question that plagued me constantly. Why didn't my husband want me anymore? What was wrong with me that had made him lose interest so completely? We never had children. In our early years together, we'd agreed to wait, but as time passed and our marriage deteriorated, the conversation about kids never progressed. Jonathan said we weren't financially ready, that our relationship needed to be stronger first, that we should wait until his career was more established. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up because the rejection hurt too much, and because I secretly worried that bringing a child into our broken marriage would be a mistake. By the time I was in my late 30s, the window was closing, and I grieved the family I'd never have even as I stayed trapped in a marriage that felt more like punishment than partnership. My friends noticed something was wrong, but I hid the details out of shame and loyalty to Jonathan. I made excuses for why we never seemed affectionate in public, why Jonathan often seemed irritated with me, why we took separate vacations and spent most evenings in different rooms of our house. I portrayed our relationship as comfortable and mature, rather than cold and dysfunctional. I convinced myself that all long-term marriages went through phases like this, that the passionate intimacy of early relationships inevitably faded into companionship, that I was being unrealistic expecting more. But I was desperately lonely and increasingly depressed. I started therapy around our 15th anniversary because I was having intrusive thoughts about how much easier life would be if I just didn't exist anymore. My therapist gently suggested that maybe the problem wasn't entirely with me, that Jonathan's behavior sounded emotionally abusive in some ways, that I deserved to be in a relationship where I felt valued and desired. I defended Jonathan automatically, explaining all the ways I'd failed as a wife, all the reasons his dissatisfaction was justified. The therapist looked at me with such sadness and said that no one deserves to be treated the way I'd been describing, regardless of physical appearance or personality flaws. Around our 17th anniversary, Jonathan started traveling more for work. He'd be gone for several days at a time, attending conferences or training workshops or consulting at other clinics. I was relieved in some ways because his absence meant I didn't have to face the constant rejection and criticism. The house felt more peaceful when he was gone, even though I was technically alone. He'd call occasionally from these trips, brief conversations where he'd ask about mundane household matters but never anything personal or intimate. I stopped asking when he'd be home or saying I missed him because those sentiments were never reciprocated. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined in my most paranoid moments, was that Jonathan had been having affairs throughout most of our marriage. Multiple affairs over the years with different women he met through work or at conferences or through online dating sites specifically for married people seeking extramarital encounters. He maintained these relationships with the same careful compartmentalization he applied to every aspect of his life. His lovers knew he was married, but believed his story that his wife was frigid and unwilling to meet his needs, that he stayed in the marriage for financial reasons, or because divorce was complicated, that he was essentially trapped in a loveless relationship. The woman who eventually exposed everything was named Melissa. She was 35 years old, a pharmaceutical sales representative who'd met Jonathan at a medical conference 3 years before she showed up at my door. They'd been in what she believed was a serious committed relationship for those 3 years. Jonathan had told her he was separated from me and living in his own apartment, that we were in the process of divorcing, but it was moving slowly through the legal system. He'd shown her apartment listings he claimed to be viewing, told her elaborate stories about custody negotiations, even though we had no children, painted himself as a man trying desperately to extricate himself from a toxic marriage so he could build a life with her. Melissa believed all of this completely for 3 years. Jonathan was careful never to bring her to our neighborhood, always met her at her place or hotels when traveling, maintained the fiction of his separate life. But eventually she started pushing for more transparency and commitment. She wanted to meet his friends, to be included in more aspects of his life, to make concrete plans for their future together. Jonathan kept deflecting and making excuses, promising things would change soon but never delivering. Melissa grew suspicious and started investigating on her own. What she discovered devastated her. Jonathan wasn't separated or divorced, or even in the process of separating. He was living full-time in our home with his wife of 20 years. There was no apartment, no custody negotiation, no imminent divorce. He'd been lying to her for 3 years about virtually every aspect of his life and situation. She was furious and heartbroken and felt like a complete fool for believing him so thoroughly for so long. So she decided to confront me. She found our address through public records, drove to our house on a Tuesday afternoon when she knew Jonathan would be at work, and knocked on our door. I answered wearing yoga pants and an old college sweatshirt, no makeup, looking exactly like what I was, which was a middle-aged woman in a failing marriage, spending another afternoon alone in her house. Melissa was dressed professionally in a pencil skirt and blouse, makeup perfect, looking polished and angry and determined. She introduced herself and asked if I was Victoria and if I was married to Jonathan. I said yes to both questions, confused and already feeling defensive. She said we needed to talk and asked if she could come inside. Something in her tone made me step aside and let her in, even though every instinct said this conversation would change everything. We sat in my living room, her on the edge of the couch and me in the armchair across from her, and she started talking. She told me she'd been having an affair with my husband for 3 years. She told me he'd lied to her about being separated and nearly divorced. She told me he'd promised her a future together, talked about traveling and eventually moving in together and building a real relationship. She told me she felt like an idiot for believing him, but that she genuinely thought he was an unhappily married man trying to leave a bad situation. Then she told me the part that shattered every assumption I'd built over 20 years. She said Jonathan had erectile dysfunction that he'd been treating with prescription medication the entire time they'd been together. She said he took pills before every intimate encounter, that he'd been open with her about his condition from the beginning of their affair, that he'd told her his dysfunction was partly psychological due to the stress of his unhappy marriage. She said he overdosed on the medication several times, taking double or triple the recommended dose trying to ensure performance, and had ended up in emergency rooms twice with dangerous side effects. She showed me copies of medical records she'd obtained somehow, prescriptions in Jonathan's name for erectile dysfunction drugs going back over 15 years. I sat there completely frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. Jonathan had erectile dysfunction. He'd had it for at least 15 years, probably longer. He'd been treating it with medication that he took before having sex with other women, but never with me. He'd blamed me for our failed sex life, told me I was unattractive and undesirable, let me torture myself for years thinking I was the problem, when all along he'd been perfectly capable of intimacy with other women because he was medicating his condition for them, but not for me. Melissa kept talking, her anger building as she detailed everything. She said Jonathan had told her I was frigid and judgmental, that I'd refused to be intimate with him for years, that I'd let myself become overweight and stopped caring about my appearance, that I was emotionally abusive and controlling. She said she'd believed all of this because Jonathan was so convincing, because he seemed genuinely unhappy, because he painted such a vivid picture of a terrible marriage. She said she felt guilty now for being part of his deception, for believing his lies about me, for participating in something that had hurt me even if she hadn't known the full truth. I asked why she was telling me all this. She said partly because she was furious with Jonathan for lying to her and wanted him to face consequences for his behavior, but also because she'd started researching erectile dysfunction after learning about his emergency room visits, and she'd realized that his condition could have been treated within our marriage if he'd been honest and willing to seek help properly. She said she'd been reading about how many men hide erectile dysfunction from their wives out of shame, how it often leads to affairs and divorce, how the secrecy and lies do more damage than the physical condition itself. She said she thought I deserved to know the truth so I could make informed decisions about my life and marriage. After Melissa left, I sat in my living room for hours as afternoon turned to evening. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there as 20 years of pain and rejection and self-blame reorganized themselves into a completely different picture. Jonathan hadn't lost attraction to me. Jonathan had a medical condition he'd been ashamed to address within our marriage. Rather than being honest and seeking treatment we could have pursued together, he'd chosen to medicate secretly while having affairs, to blame me for our intimacy problems, to let me suffer thinking I was fundamentally undesirable. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not just the affairs, though those were devastating enough, but the deliberate campaign to make me believe I was the problem, to destroy my self-esteem systematically over years, to reject me physically while successfully being intimate with other women, to watch me torture myself, trying to become attractive enough to interest him again when he knew the whole time that attraction wasn't the issue. He'd used his medical condition as a weapon against me, wielded his shame and pride like clubs to beat me down emotionally while he maintained his ego by proving his manhood with women who didn't know the full truth about him. When Jonathan came home that evening around 7, I was still sitting in the same chair. He walked in cheerfully asking what was for dinner, and I said we needed to talk. Something in my voice made him stop and look at me carefully. I asked him if he knew a woman named Melissa. His face went completely white. I said she'd visited me that afternoon and told me everything about their 3-year affair, his lies to her about being separated, and most importantly, his erectile dysfunction that he'd been treating with medication for over 15 years while blaming me for our failed sex life. Jonathan's response told me everything I needed to know. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to explain. He just got angry and defensive, saying Melissa was a psycho who couldn't accept that their relationship was over, that she was lying about most of what she'd told me, that I shouldn't believe anything that came from a woman desperate enough to show up at his wife's house. But he couldn't explain away the medical records she'd shown me or the prescriptions or the documented emergency room visits. He couldn't explain why he'd been taking erectile dysfunction medication for affairs, but had never mentioned having this condition to me in 20 years of marriage. I asked him directly, "Why did you let me think I was the problem? Why did you blame me and criticize my appearance and make me feel worthless instead of just being honest about having a medical condition we could have addressed together? Why did you treat your affairs as worth medicating for but not your marriage?" His answer was pathetic. He said he'd been embarrassed, that he didn't want me to know he needed pills to function sexually, that it felt like admitting he wasn't man enough. He said it was easier to maintain his affairs because those women had no expectations or history with him, while with me there was too much pressure and too much at stake. I told him to leave. He tried to argue, saying we could go to counseling, that he'd end all affairs and commit to working on our marriage, that we'd invested 20 years together and shouldn't throw that away. I said we didn't have a marriage to save because our entire relationship had been built on his lies and my ignorance of the truth. I said I'd wasted 20 years believing I was fundamentally unlovable, when really I'd just been married to a coward who'd rather destroy my self-worth than face his own shame, honestly. I told him I wanted a divorce. and he needed to find somewhere else to stay immediately. The divorce was remarkably simple, given how complicated the emotional situation was. We had no children, had kept our finances mostly separate, owned our condo jointly but agreed to sell it and split the proceeds. Jonathan didn't fight me on anything because he knew his behavior was indefensible, and because he was terrified I'd expose the details publicly and damage his professional reputation. The whole process took about 8 months from when I filed papers to when our divorce was finalized. I moved into a small apartment near the hospital where I worked. Jonathan moved in with another woman he'd apparently been seeing concurrently with Melissa, someone he'd met through an online affair site. The emotional recovery was infinitely harder than the legal divorce. I had to process not just 20 years of a failed marriage, but 20 years of misplaced blame and self-hatred. I'd spent 2 decades believing I was unattractive, undesirable, fundamentally flawed in ways that had destroyed my husband's interest in me. Learning that none of that was true, that Jonathan had simply been too ashamed and selfish to address his medical condition honestly, required completely rebuilding my self-concept and sense of worth. Therapy became essential during this period. My therapist helped me understand that Jonathan's behavior constituted a form of emotional abuse. He'd systematically destroyed my self-esteem to protect his ego and avoid facing his shame. He'd preferred to watch me suffer rather than be vulnerable about his struggles. He'd used gaslighting to convince me that my perceptions were wrong and that our intimacy problems were my fault. Understanding this intellectually was one thing, but healing from it emotionally took years. I also started educating myself extensively about erectile dysfunction. I learned that it's incredibly common, affecting millions of men to varying degrees, and that it's almost always treatable with medication, therapy, lifestyle changes, or combinations of approaches. I learned that shame and secrecy around the condition often causes more relationship damage than the physical dysfunction itself. I learned that many men hide erectile problems from their partners out of fear that admitting sexual difficulty means admitting inadequacy as a man. I learned that this toxic masculinity bullshit destroys marriages and ruins lives when vulnerability and honest communication could preserve relationships and intimacy. What made me angriest was realizing how treatable Jonathan's condition had been all along. If he'd been honest with me early in our marriage, we could have addressed it together. We could have tried different medications, explored therapy for any psychological components, adjusted our approach to intimacy to accommodate his needs. Instead, he'd chosen secrecy and affairs, and a campaign to destroy my self-worth so he could avoid facing his shame. He'd sacrificed our marriage and my emotional well-being to protect his fragile ego. I also felt complicated emotions about Melissa. She'd been complicit in an affair that hurt me even if she hadn't known the full truth of the situation. But she'd also been lied to and manipulated by Jonathan, just as I had been. She'd believed his stories about a failing marriage and had seen herself as a future partner rather than a secret mistress. When she discovered the depth of his deception, she'd done the difficult thing and exposed it rather than slinking away quietly. Her confrontation had freed me from a lie I'd been living for 20 years. I sent her a letter months later, thanking her for having the courage to tell me the truth, even though I knew it had been painful for her too. Friends and family were shocked when I filed for divorce. From the outside, our marriage had looked stable, if not passionate. When I explained what had really been happening, many people expressed guilt for not seeing the signs or asking harder questions. My mother cried and said she'd always thought Jonathan was cold toward me, but had assumed I was happy enough. My closest friend said she'd wondered about our lack of physical affection, but hadn't wanted to pry. Everyone had noticed something was off, but no one had spoken up, and I'd been too ashamed to admit the truth about how lonely and rejected I felt. The first year after my divorce was incredibly difficult, but also strangely liberating. I was 43 years old, living alone for the first time in my adult life, processing 2 decades of emotional damage, but also finally free from the constant criticism and rejection that had defined my marriage. I could breathe fully for the first time in years. I could wear whatever I wanted without worrying someone would criticize my appearance. I could eat without guilt or anxiety about weight. I could exist without the constant low-level dread of being found inadequate. I also started slowly rebuilding my self-image. I realized that I'd actually become quite attractive in my 40s in ways I'd been too beaten down to recognize. I took new profile pictures for social media and was startled by how much more confident and alive I looked compared to photos from my marriage where I appeared diminished and anxious. I started dating cautiously after about a year, nothing serious, but just experiencing being desired and wanted by men who actually found me attractive. It was revelatory and healing in ways I hadn't expected. 2 years after my divorce, I met someone who became genuinely important to me. His name was Michael. He was 51 and divorced with 2 adult children. We met through a friend's dinner party and discovered we had similar experiences of marriages that had failed due to secrets and poor communication. Michael's ex-wife had hidden a gambling addiction that had nearly bankrupted them. He understood betrayal and the slow erosion of trust and the work required to rebuild yourself after that kind of loss. What I appreciated most about Michael was his willingness to be vulnerable and honest from the beginning. He told me about his insecurities and fears. He asked questions about my past without judgment. When our relationship became physical, he checked in constantly about my comfort and desires, understanding that I was still healing from years of rejection and criticism. He treated intimacy as something we created together, rather than something he performed for my approval. It was completely different from anything I'd experienced with Jonathan. I'm now 48 years old, 5 years past my divorce, and finally at peace with everything that happened. I'm angry about the wasted years and the emotional damage Jonathan caused, but I'm no longer consumed by that anger. I've built a life that feels authentically mine, rather than a performance for someone else's approval. I've maintained my nursing career and recently moved into a management position I find deeply satisfying. I have strong friendships and family relationships. I have a partner who values honesty and mutual respect. I have self-worth that isn't dependent on anyone else's validation. What I want people to understand from my story is that erectile dysfunction is not the problem that destroys marriages. Shame, secrecy, lies, and the weaponization of medical conditions to avoid vulnerability, those are what destroy marriages. If Jonathan had been honest about his struggles, if he'd been willing to face his shame and work on the issue together with me, we might have had a chance. Instead, he chose to protect his ego at the expense of my well-being and our marriage. That choice revealed character flaws that went far deeper than any physical condition. I also want women who are in similar situations to know that if your partner is consistently rejecting you physically, consistently criticizing your appearance, consistently making you feel inadequate and undesirable, the problem is very likely not you. It's incredibly common for men to hide erectile dysfunction and other sexual difficulties by blaming their partners rather than addressing their own issues honestly. You are not responsible for someone else's shame or their refusal to seek appropriate help. You deserve honesty and respect in partnership, not gaslighting and emotional abuse disguised as critique. The phrase that kept running through my mind after learning the truth was that hiding impotence does not make a man weak, but using it to manipulate a woman absolutely does. Jonathan's medical condition was understandable and treatable. His choice to handle it through lies, affairs, and systematic destruction of my self-esteem was unforgivable. The weakness wasn't in his body, but in his character, in his willingness to protect himself at my expense, in his preference for comfortable lies over difficult honesty. I share this story now in hopes that it helps other women who are quietly suffering in marriages where they feel rejected and inadequate and increasingly invisible. I want you to know that you're probably not the problem. I want you to question narratives that blame you for your partner's inability to be intimate. I want you to demand honesty and reject relationships built on shame and secrecy. I want you to know that it's never too late to leave and rebuild and discover that you were lovable all along. The right person will see your worth. The right person will be honest about their struggles. The right person will work with you rather than against you. For 20 years, I carried blame that wasn't mine. For 20 years, I tried to fix something that was never broken in me. For 20 years, I accepted treatment that no one deserves. But I survived. I rebuilt. I discovered my worth wasn't dependent on someone else's ability to see it. And now I'm free in ways I never imagined possible during those dark years. If you're reading this and seeing yourself in my story, please know that freedom is possible for you too. The pain you're carrying doesn't have to define the rest of your life. The lies you've been told about yourself aren't true. You deserve so much better than what you're accepting. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever blamed yourself for someone else's shame, if you've carried pain you didn't deserve, smash that like button and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear they're not the problem. Drop a comment telling me, what is your biggest pain right now? Your story matters. Your healing starts here. Remember that you are worthy exactly as you are, that honesty is the foundation of real love, and that it's never too late to choose yourself.